Evolution of architectural styles. Architecture is often described as frozen music, a durable, tangible manifestation of a civilization's culture, climate, philosophy, and history. As human societies evolved from nomadic hunter-gatherer bands into sedentary agricultural communities, the necessity of basic shelter transformed into a complex discipline that married creative expression with structural engineering. The advent of civilization depended entirely upon the ability of early agricultural settlements to consistently produce a surplus of food. This critical surplus allowed populations to specialize in non-agricultural labor, paving the way for social stratification, centralized governance, and the establishment of complex religious systems. It is at this transformative juncture in human history that architecture transcended mere survival and became a mechanism for projecting power, communicating with the divine, and organizing civic life on an unprecedented scale. Tracing the chronological progression of architectural styles from the ancient world through the mid-19th century reveals a profound narrative of human adaptation and ambition. Every major architectural movement has been inextricably bound to four primary driving forces: the availability of local materials, the threshold of technological limitations and innovations, the prevailing religious and cosmological beliefs, and the dynamic socio-political climates of the era. By undertaking a comprehensive deep-dive analysis of the foundational epochs of worldwide architectural styles, spanning ancient monumentalism, classical antiquity, Eastern traditions, the Middle Ages, and the dramatic philosophical shifts from the Renaissance to Neoclassicism and the Gothic Revival, it is possible to decipher the underlying forces that have shaped the physical and psychological landscapes of human history across the globe. Ancient monumentalism, the architecture of power, cosmos, and eternity. The earliest complex urban centers arose independently in geographic regions that were highly favorable to intensive agriculture, most notably in the river valleys of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the diverse landscapes of Mesoamerica. The architecture produced by these early civilizations is defined by monumentalism, the construction of massive, large-scale structures designed to convey absolute power, divine prestige, and cultural identity. The sheer scale of these edifices required the mobilization of vast labor forces, indicating a high degree of social organization and a strict hierarchy where centralized authorities could command immense resources. Monumental structures were typically located at the very center of civic life, emphasizing their dual role in both daily administration and spiritual practice. In the Fertile Crescent located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq, the ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, comprising the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, established the world's first complex urban states. The geography of Mesopotamia was inherently volatile. The rivers flooded unpredictably, and the region lacked abundant natural resources such as stone and structural timber. Consequently, Mesopotamian builders relied heavily on the earth itself, utilizing sun-dried mud bricks and baked bricks bound with bitumen, a naturally occurring tar that served as an incredibly durable mortar. Because mud brick is highly susceptible to erosion and environmental degradation, these structures required constant maintenance, reflecting a worldview shaped by the unpredictable and often destructive forces of nature. The paramount architectural achievement of Mesopotamia was the ziggurat. The ziggurat is a form of monumental architecture that usually featured a rectangular base and was built in a series of receding, terraced steps leading up to a flat platform upon which a temple was raised. The ziggurat functioned as an artificial mountain raised for the worship of the gods, designed to elevate the priesthood toward the heavens and bridge the earthly and divine realms. It is speculated that the Sumerian people originated from mountainous regions and sought to recreate sacred high places on the flat plains of Mesopotamia. Unlike later religious structures in other cultures, the ziggurat was not a public house of worship. Rather, it was considered the literal earthly dwelling of the city's patron deity, attended solely by high priests who performed rituals in view of the populace far below. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, constructed during the early 21st century BCE under the reign of King Ur-Nammu and completed by his son Shulgi, stands as the best preserved example of this typology. Dedicated to the moon god Nana, the structure originally measured approximately 210 feet in length, 150 feet in width, and rose originally between 70 and 100 feet in height across 3 monumental terraces. The core of the ziggurat was constructed of mud brick, which was then meticulously covered with baked bricks laid with bitumen, a thick shield against rainfall and temperature changes. 3 massive, dramatic staircases converged at a gate on the first terrace level, strictly controlling access, before a single staircase rose to the uppermost shrine. The ziggurat served dual purposes. It was the spiritual epicenter of the city-state and a towering symbol of the ruler's political authority and ability to manage agricultural wealth. This synthesis of religion and statecraft in the mud brick horizons of the ancient Near East laid the foundational blueprint for how architecture could enforce social order. In stark contrast to the turbulent and unpredictable environment of Mesopotamia, the regular cyclical flooding of the Nile River in Egypt fostered a civilization deeply invested in concepts of permanence, cosmic harmony, and the afterlife. Egyptian culture was dominated by a highly centralized political structure governed by the pharaoh, who was venerated as a living deity. As a reflection of this rigid hierarchy, Egyptian monumental architecture revolved almost entirely around the individual person of the pharaoh, focusing on the preservation of their physical body and spiritual essence for eternity. Egyptian mortuary architecture evolved significantly over time. During the early dynasties, pharaohs were buried in mastabas, which were simple, flat-roofed mud brick mounds used as burial tombs. However, the defining technological and conceptual leap occurred in the late 27th century BCE under the guidance of Imhotep. Serving as chancellor to Pharaoh Djoser, Imhotep revolutionized construction by designing the step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara. Imhotep transitioned from perishable mud brick to durable dressed stone, an unprecedented engineering feat that established stone as the only material worthy of housing the divine. While mud brick remained the primary material for domestic dwellings and even royal palaces, stone was reserved exclusively for the eternal houses of the gods and the dead. Imhotep's architectural genius was so revered that he was deified roughly 2,000 years after his death, becoming a god of medicine and healing. This trajectory culminated during the Old Kingdom with the construction of the Great Pyramids of Giza. Built primarily from locally quarried limestone, these colossal, true-sided pyramids defied gravity through sheer mass and volume. The geometry of the pyramids and their surrounding temple complexes was meticulously tied to the paths of the sun and the stars, acting as physical symbols of the sun god Ra and facilitating the pharaoh's ascent to the heavens. Furthermore, the Egyptians created the obelisk, a towering monolithic pillar that functioned as a physical symbol of Ra, placed at the entrances of temples to catch the first rays of the morning sun. The construction of these monuments required the logistical mastery to organize, feed, and direct tens of thousands of skilled laborers over decades, serving as the ultimate demonstration of the pharaoh's absolute socio-political control. Developing independently across the Atlantic Ocean, the civilizations of Mesoamerica, encompassing the Olmec, Maya, Zapotec, and eventually the Mexica, Aztec, produced their own distinct, highly sophisticated traditions of monumental architecture. Unlike the river valley civilizations of the Middle East, Mesoamerica featured incredibly diverse geography, ranging from humid tropical jungles and low coastal plains to arid deserts and high mountainous terrain. Mesoamerican societies transitioned from hunter-gatherer cultures to permanent agricultural settlements centered around the cultivation of maize, beans, and squash, allowing for the rise of complex urban centers. Mesoamerican architecture is characterized by its monumental stepped pyramids, expansive ceremonial plazas, ball courts, and astronomical observatories. Driven by a complex polytheistic religion that demanded constant appeasement of the gods to maintain cosmic balance, Mesoamerican cities were meticulously aligned with the cardinal directions and significant astronomical events. Utilizing locally available materials such as limestone, sun-dried adobe bricks, and volcanic stones like basalt and tezontle, builders constructed massive earth mounds faced with precisely cut stone. Unlike Egyptian pyramids, which were primarily sealed tombs designed to protect the dead, Mesoamerican pyramids were active stages for public ritual. Structures such as the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan or El Castillo at Chichen Itza featured steep, dramatic exterior staircases leading to flat summit platforms housing temples. Access to these elevated sanctuaries was strictly limited to the priestly elite, physically manifesting the social hierarchy while allowing the masses gathered in the plazas below to witness religious ceremonies. Astronomical alignment was a paramount driving force in Mesoamerican urban planning. Entire architectural assemblages such as the E-groups found at Maya sites like Huaxatan and Tikal were constructed specifically to track the solstices and equinoxes, functioning as massive stone calendars. In the great metropolis of Teotihuacan, the entire street grid and the colossal Pyramid of the Sun were intentionally oriented to align with the rising and setting of celestial bodies, most notably the Pleiades and Sirius. Through precise astronomical alignment and monumental scale, Mesoamerican architecture effectively merged the built environment with the mythological universe, embedding the passage of time directly into the stone of their cities. Furthermore, the Maya advanced architectural engineering through the invention of the corbelled vault, allowing for the creation of durable, enclosed stone rooms atop their pyramids. Classical antiquity, proportion, civic engineering, and the human scale. As the locus of Western architectural innovation shifted toward the Mediterranean, classical antiquity witnessed the development of architectural systems that fundamentally departed from the sheer, overwhelming mass of early monumentalism. The architecture of ancient Greece and Rome focused instead on human proportion, mathematical harmony, and unprecedented civil engineering, establishing a formal vocabulary that continues to dominate institutional architecture today. Ancient Greek architecture was deeply rooted in the philosophical principles of humanism, rationalism, and the pursuit of ideal beauty. Transitioning away from early timber, post, and beam construction, the Greeks began utilizing local limestone and later pristine white marble to build enduring monuments to their gods and civic institutions. The defining achievement of Greek architecture was the creation of the architectural orders, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, which functioned as a highly formalized structural and aesthetic grammar. These orders dictated not only the type of column used, but the exact proportions, profiles, and relationships between every element of a building, establishing a visual language based on the intervals of classical music. The Doric order, the oldest and most massive of the three, emerged on the Greek mainland in the late 7th century BCE. It is characterized by stout, fluted columns that rest directly on the floor, the stylobate, without a base, topped with a simple, cushion-like capital. The Roman architect Vitruvius later compared the sturdy, rigorous proportions of the Doric order to the male body. The Doric entablature featured a frieze divided into alternating vertically grooved blocks called triglyphs and sculptured panels called metopes. In contrast, the Ionic order, which developed in eastern Greece, presented a lighter, more graceful profile, likened to feminine proportions. It is distinguished by slender columns that stand on a base, capitals adorned with scroll-like ornaments known as volutes, and an entablature that replaces the triglyphs and metopes with a continuous running frieze of sculptural relief. The supreme embodiment of Greek architectural philosophy is the Parthenon, constructed on the Athenian Acropolis between 447 and 432 BCE. Directed by statesman Pericles, designed by the architects Ictinus and Callicrates, and overseen by the sculptor Phidias, the Parthenon was built to honor Athena and serve as the treasury for the Delian League. As an octastyle peripitral Doric temple, it is entirely encircled by massive columns. The driving force behind the Parthenon was an obsession with geometric harmony, heavily influenced by the golden ratio, which became commonly known by the Greek letter phi in honor of Phidias. However, the Greeks understood that mathematical perfection does not always translate to visual perfection. Because the human eye perceives perfectly straight lines on a massive scale as sagging, the architects introduced a series of brilliant optical refinements. The stylobate bows slightly upward in the center, the columns lean imperceptibly inward, and the column shafts feature entasis, a subtle convex swelling that mimics the organic compression of weight. Furthermore, the corner columns were made slightly thicker to counteract the thinning effect of the bright Greek sky behind them. Greek artisans achieved this extreme precision in stone craftsmanship through dry masonry techniques, fitting marble blocks together flawlessly with hidden metal clamps and dowels. The Parthenon functioned simultaneously as a religious sanctuary and a powerful piece of political propaganda, symbolizing Athenian democracy and cultural supremacy following their victories in the Greco-Persian Wars. When the Roman Republic and subsequent empire absorbed Greek territories, they appropriated the external language of the classical orders, but fundamentally transformed the execution and purpose of architecture through revolutionary civil engineering. While Greek architecture was essentially sculptural, designed as isolated objects to be viewed from the exterior in the open landscape, Roman architecture was dedicated to the enclosure and manipulation of vast interior spaces required for complex civic administration and public life. The primary catalyst for this architectural revolution was the invention and perfection of Roman concrete, known as opus cementitium. By mixing lime mortar, aggregate, and volcanic ash known as pozzolana, the Romans created an exceptionally strong, durable material that could set and harden even entirely underwater. Freed from the strict limitations of the Greek post and lintel system, which required columns to be placed closely together to support heavy stone beams, Roman architects mastered arcuation, the structural use of the arch. By extending arches into barrel vaults, crossing them to create groin vaults, and rotating them to form massive domes, the Romans were able to span immense distances without interrupting the floor plan with supporting columns. This technological breakthrough facilitated the construction of unprecedented civic infrastructure, including vast basilicas for law and commerce, monumental bathhouses, thermae, aqueducts that carried fresh water across valleys, and massive amphitheaters like the Colosseum. The Pantheon in Rome stands as the crowning achievement of Roman engineering and spatial philosophy. Originally commissioned by Marcus Agrippa as a temple to Mars and Venus, it was completely rebuilt by Emperor Hadrian around 126 CE as a temple dedicated to all the Roman gods. Approaching the building, the viewer is presented with a traditional Greek-style portico supported by massive granite Corinthian columns. However, passing through the bronze doors reveals a staggering, unexpected interior, a colossal circular rotunda covered by an unreinforced concrete dome. Measuring exactly 43.3 meters in diameter, the dome's width perfectly matches the height from the floor to the oculus, a circular opening at the apex. This means a perfect geometric sphere could fit exactly within the interior space, creating a profound sense of mathematical balance and cosmic harmony. The oculus serves as the sole source of natural light, acting as a sundial while simultaneously reducing the dead weight of the dome at its weakest and highest point. The Romans further reduced the dome's weight by utilizing progressively lighter aggregate, from heavy basalt at the base to light pumice near the top, and by carving recessed panels, coffers, into the ceiling. The pantheon represents a critical shift in human consciousness, the transition from the exclusive, exterior-focused Greek temple to an inclusive, awe-inspiring interior volume that physically encapsulated the vast, unifying, and inescapable power of the Roman Empire. Eastern traditions, harmony, cosmology, and materiality. While the Mediterranean world focused on stone masonry, structural arches, and the domination of the environment, the Eastern traditions of East and South Asia pursued profoundly different philosophies regarding materiality, structure, and spatial organization. Eastern architecture prioritized harmony between the built structure and the natural landscape, heavily informed by spiritual frameworks such as Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. Chinese architecture developed a distinct continuous tradition spanning millennia, fundamentally relying on timber frame construction. Because wood is highly vulnerable to fire, rot, and warfare, few ancient wooden structures survive today, yet the core structural principles remained remarkably consistent and widely influenced the architecture of Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. The defining technological innovation of Chinese timber architecture is the dogong bracket system, consisting of interlocking wooden bearing blocks, do, and bow-shaped cantilevered arms, gong. The dogong acts as a crucial transitional node. The pieces are fitted together using highly precise mortise and tenon joinery without any use of nails or glue. The primary function of the dugong is to transfer the immense, crushing weight of the sweeping, heavy ceramic tile roofs down into the vertical wooden columns, spreading the load over a larger area. This exoskeletal timber framework provided two massive advantages. First, it meant that the walls of a Chinese building carried no structural weight. They functioned merely as curtain walls, made of latticework or mud, delineating spaces and providing exceptional interior flexibility. Second, the interlocking, nail-free joinery gave the structure incredible tensile flexibility. During an earthquake, the dugong brackets could flex, shift, and dissipate seismic energy without snapping, allowing massive structures to survive centuries of tremors. The socio-political and philosophical drivers of Chinese architecture were deeply rooted in Confucianism, which emphasized strict social hierarchy, respect for authority, and adherence to state-defined order. This translated into rigid, highly formalized urban planning. Cities and palace compounds were laid out on strict grid systems enclosed by fortified walls, with paramount importance placed on bilateral symmetry and alignment with the cardinal directions, specifically the north-south axis. The imperial complexes, such as the Forbidden City in Beijing, were placed at the absolute center, requiring visitors to pass through successive, imposing walled gates that physically enforced the dominance and unapproachable status of the emperor. Conversely, Taoist philosophies, which advocated for a mystical, non-authoritarian harmony with nature, influenced the asymmetrical, organic layouts of traditional Chinese gardens. When Buddhism arrived from India via the Silk Road, the Chinese adapted the hemispherical Indian stupa into the towering, multi-tiered pagoda. Utilizing their timber framing mastery, they changed the circular plan into a multi-cornered design, creating performing centers of vertical ascension that dominated the landscape while housing sacred relics. Japanese architecture assimilated significant technical and religious influence from the Asian mainland, notably importing Buddhism and Chinese timber framing joinery during the Han Dynasty via the Korean peninsula. This complex interlocking wooden joinery, known in Japan as kigumi, utilizes precision mortise and tenon techniques to connect wood without metal fasteners. Because metal fasteners can shear or tear through wood during earthquakes, the flexible kigumi joints dissipate seismic energy through subtle movement, ensuring structural resilience in Japan's highly active seismic zones. However, Japan synthesized these continental imports with its indigenous Shinto religion, which deeply venerated the natural forces and animistic spirits residing in trees, mountains, and waterfalls. This unique synthesis birthed an architectural tradition characterized by profound minimalism, an absolute reverence for raw, unpainted materials, and a deliberate blurring of the boundaries between interior and exterior spaces. Unlike the Chinese, who frequently painted their wooden structures in vibrant colors, the Japanese preferred to leave wood exposed, appreciating the natural grain and avoiding paint as a sign of respect for the material's innate beauty. The Katsura Imperial Villa in Kyoto, constructed in the early 17th century by Prince Toshihito, stands as the quintessential masterpiece of this tradition. Built as an aristocratic retreat for activities such as moon viewing and poetry readings inspired by the tale of Genji, Katsura perfectly embodies the Zen Buddhist and Shinto aesthetic of wabi-sabi. Wabi-sabi is a philosophical appreciation for rustic simplicity, asymmetry, impermanence, and the melancholy, muted beauty of natural aging. The villa rejects the monumental, imposing grandeur of symmetrical palaces in favor of a sprawling, staggered, zigzagging layout that optimizes airflow and light. The proportions of Katsura, and indeed all traditional Japanese domestic architecture, are strictly dictated by the modular dimensions of the tatami floor mat, measuring approximately 3 by 6 feet. Raised on wooden posts to protect against humidity and provide stability, the structure utilizes sliding paper screens, fusama, rather than solid masonry walls. This allows the rooms to be continuously resized and reconfigured, or opened entirely to the wooden verandas and gawa and the meticulously curated stroll gardens beyond. The gardens themselves are a labyrinthine composition of miniature landscapes, ponds, and islands. The tea houses scattered throughout the grounds, such as the Shokin-tei Pine Lute Pavilion, are rustic pavilions featuring unbarked wooden supports and irregular materials. The entrances were designed deliberately lower, forcing guests to bow as they enter, thereby stripping away social rank and fostering an intimate, egalitarian reflection. The Japanese mastery of spatial fluidity, modularity, and truth to materials at Katsura later served as a profound revelation and inspiration for 20th-century Western modernist architects like Le Corbusier, Bruno Taut, and Frank Lloyd Wright. In the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia, religious architecture was dominated by Hinduism and Buddhism, culminating in structures designed to serve as literal, physical models of the cosmos. The foundational concept of Hindu temple architecture is the Vastu Purusha Mandala, a sacred geometric grid that aligns the building with cosmic energies, mathematical principles, the cardinal directions, and the deities of the Hindu pantheon. According to legend, the Vastu Purusha was a formless, chaotic cosmic being who was pinned to the ground by the gods to restore order. The mandala represents this transformation from chaos to cosmic harmony. The grid is typically a perfect square, often composed of 64 or 81 smaller squares, representing the cosmos as a unified whole. At the very heart of the mandala lies the Brahma Stan, an energetic nucleus that is often left open or clear of heavy pillars to allow for the unobstructed flow of spiritual energy. The fundamental core of a Hindu temple relies on this geometry, featuring a dark, unadorned, cave-like inner sanctum known as the Garbha Griha, womb chamber, that houses the primary image of the deity, crowned on the exterior by a towering superstructure. Over centuries, Indian temple architecture diverged into two primary regional styles. The Nagara style of northern India is characterized by a curvilinear beehive-shaped tower, shikara, that rises continuously over the sanctum, emphasizing a reaching verticality. These towers are often topped with a large stone disc known as an amalaka, and the facades feature decorative arches called gavakshas. The heavily sculpted Kandariya Mahadev Temple in Khajuraho is a prime example of this style. The Dravidian style of southern India features straight-edged, stepped pyramidal towers, vimana, over the sanctum. More distinctively, Dravidian temples feature massive, elaborately carved gateway towers known as gopurams that pierce the concentric enclosure walls, emphasizing horizontal expansion and creating vast temple cities that functioned as economic and cultural hubs. These complex architectural and cosmological principles proliferated via maritime trade routes to Southeast Asia, where they were adopted and wildly expanded by the Khmer Empire in present-day Cambodia. Angkor Wat, constructed in the early 12th century by King Suryavarman II, represents the absolute zenith of this architectural tradition. Originally dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu and likely intended as the king's funerary mausoleum, the complex spans over 400 acres and remains the largest religious structure in the world. Angkor Wat is the ultimate realization of the Temple Mountain concept, oriented highly unusually toward the west rather than the east. Its 5 central lotus bud-shaped sandstone towers symbolize the peaks of Mount Meru, the mythical dwelling place of the gods in Hindu cosmology. The vast surrounding moats represent the cosmic oceans at the edge of the universe, while the concentric outer walls signify the mountain ranges guarding the sacred space. Unlike traditional Indian temples, which relied heavily on freestanding sculpture, Angkor Wat is famous for its miles of intricate bas-reliefs carved directly into the gallery walls, depicting Hindu epics like the Ramayana and the churning of the ocean of milk, a scene symbolizing the triumph of cosmic order over chaos. The architecture functions as a massive three-dimensional theological map, requiring the worshipper to undergo a physical and spiritual ascension through concentric ascending galleries to reach the central shrine. As the Khmer Empire transitioned politically and spiritually in the late 13th century, Angkor Wat seamlessly evolved from a Hindu epicenter to a Theravada Buddhist sanctuary, its precise sandstone masonry enduring as a timeless testament to the synthesis of divine kingship and sacred geometry. The Middle Ages, heavenly light, earthly fortresses, and cultural synthesis. Following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, Europe entered a protracted period of political fragmentation and turbulence. Simultaneously, the Eastern Roman, Byzantine Empire, and the rapidly expanding Islamic world preserved, synthesized, and drastically advanced ancient architectural knowledge. In the later Middle Ages, the resurgence of European stability, the consolidation of royal power, and the immense wealth of the Catholic Church sparked an architectural revolution that pushed stone masonry construction to its absolute physical limits. When Emperor Constantine shifted the capital of the Roman Empire to Constantinople, modern Istanbul, Byzantine architecture emerged as a magnificent fusion of Roman engineering expertise and Eastern Christian mysticism. Byzantine architects retained the Roman mastery of concrete and brick, but sought to create spaces that felt less grounded and more ethereal, emphasizing verticality, interior spatial drama, and spiritual symbolism. The defining achievement of the Byzantine era is the Hagia Sophia, Church of the Holy Wisdom, commissioned by Emperor Justinian I in 532 CE, following the destructive Nika riots which burned down the previous church on the site. Designed by the mathematician Anthemius of Tralles and the physicist Isidore of Milet, the structure tackled one of the most profound engineering challenges in history, placing a massive, continuous circular dome over a square basilican floor plan. The architect solved this via the unprecedented use of pendentives, curved triangular vaulting segments in the corners of the square base that smoothly transition the shape to a circle and channel the immense weight of the dome down into 4 massive piers. Because the weight was carried by the piers rather than the walls, the area immediately beneath the dome could be pierced by 40 closely spaced windows. The influx of natural light combined with the extensive use of shimmering gold leaf mosaics created the powerful optical illusion that the 184-foot-high dome was entirely weightless, suspended from heaven by a golden chain. Over its turbulent 1,500-year history, the socio-political identity of the Hagia Sophia has been remarkably fluid. During the 8th and 9th centuries, the building suffered through the iconoclastic controversy, during which figural mosaics were banned and stripped away. Following the end of iconoclasm in 843 CE, new exquisite figural mosaics, such as the Virgin and Child in the apse, were added to reaffirm Orthodox faith. The building was seized by Western Catholic Crusaders in 1204 CE, but returned to Eastern Orthodox Church in 1261 CE. Following the Ottoman conquest in 1453 CE, it was converted to a mosque by Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror. The Ottomans plastered over the Christian mosaics and added distinctly Islamic architectural motifs, including 4 towering minarets, massive calligraphic medallions, a mihrab, and a minbar. In 2020, the status was reverted to a functioning mosque. This continuous physical and cultural adaptation underscores a powerful truth. Architecture of sufficient monumentality, engineering genius, and spatial dominance transcends its original sectarian intent to become a universally adaptable symbol of absolute power for whoever occupies it. Running parallel to the Western Middle Ages, Islamic civilization expanded rapidly from the Arabian Peninsula across the Middle East, North Africa, and into the Iberian Peninsula, Spain. Islamic architecture was profoundly shaped by the religious tenets of Islam, most notably the concept of aniconism, the avoidance of depicting sentient beings, humans and animals, in religious art to prevent idolatry. Prevented from using figurative sculpture or painting, Islamic architects and artisans channeled their creative expression into the absolute perfection of mathematics, complex floral arabesques, and masterful Arabic calligraphy. Driven by the functional requirements of communal prayer, the mosque became the primary architectural form. Mosques typically featured large, open courtyards to accommodate vast congregations, a qibla wall indicating the direction of Mecca, a mihrab niche to focus prayer, and tall, slender towers known as minarets from which the faithful were called to worship. Islamic architecture was highly assimilative, absorbing and refining engineering elements from the Byzantine, Persian, and Roman cultures it encountered. Islamic builders adopted Byzantine dome technologies and vastly expanded the vocabulary of the Roman arch. A crucial innovation was the popularization of the horseshoe arch, which was initially used by the Visigoths, but fully developed as a structural and decorative emblem in Islamic architecture, appearing prominently in the Umayyad Great Mosque of Damascus and later in the Great Mosque of Cordoba. Furthermore, Islamic architects heavily utilized the pointed arch and complex ribbed vaulting in structures like the Great Mosque of Tlemcen and the Al-Jaferia of Zaragoza. These advanced vaulting and arch systems allowed for taller, more open spaces and would eventually be transmitted to Europe to directly catalyze the Gothic architectural revolution. Masterpieces such as the Alhambra Palace complex in Spain showcase the Islamic mastery of intricate geometric tile work, mathematically precise proportions, and the soothing integration of nature and water elements into the built environment. In Western Europe, as the chaos of the early Middle Ages subsided and political stability began to return around the turn of the first millennium, the Romanesque style emerged as the first truly pan-European architectural movement since the fall of Rome. The primary driving forces behind Romanesque architecture were the explosive growth of monasticism, the rising cult of relics, and the immense popularity of mass religious pilgrimages across the continent. The church required massive new structures to accommodate growing congregations and protect valuable sacred artifacts. Drawing heavily upon the surviving ruins of Roman basilicas, Romanesque architecture is defined by an overwhelming emphasis on sheer physical mass. Structures were built with immensely thick stone masonry walls, robust sturdy pillars, and heavy stone ceilings utilizing barrel vaults and groin vaults. The defining visual motif of the era was the Roman semicircular or rounded arch, used extensively in doorways, windows, and decorative arcades. However, the structural limitations of the rounded arch presented a severe challenge. The heavy stone roofs exerted a tremendous outward thrust that threatened to push the walls outward and collapse the building. To counteract this, builders were forced to rely on continuous, immensely thick stone walls with very few tiny window penetrations, resulting in dark, somber, and deeply earthbound interiors. The exteriors were often heavily fortified, featuring large, sturdy towers. Ultimately, Romanesque cathedrals and castles served a dual psychological and practical purpose. They were spiritual sanctuaries, but in a fractured, violent feudal society, their fortress-like solidity provided literal security against attack, conveying the uncompromising, immovable strength of the church. By the mid-12th century, a confluence of growing urban wealth, the consolidation of royal power in France, and a profound shift in Christian theology birthed the Gothic architectural style. Originating in the Île-de-France region at the Abbey of Saint-Denis under the visionary patronage of Abbot Suger, Gothic architecture explicitly sought to recreate a heavenly environment on earth. Suger was heavily influenced by the writings of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, a mystic philosopher who equated divine presence with physical light, lux. Suger believed that material beauty could elevate the human mind to the spiritual realm, and that a church filled with light would lead worshippers to divine truth. To flood the church with this divine light and elevate the minds of the worshippers, builders had to completely rethink structural engineering, leading to the dissolution of the heavy, restrictive Romanesque wall. Gothic architecture achieved its staggering verticality and brilliant luminosity through the synthesis of three revolutionary engineering components. First, the pointed arch, an innovation previously observed in Islamic architecture, replaced the rounded Romanesque arch. The pointed arch channels the weight of the roof much more directly downward rather than outward, reducing the horizontal thrust and allowing for taller, more slender profiles. Second, the ribbed vault provided a lightweight intersecting skeletal framework of stone arches that pushed the load downwards and outwards onto rows of columns or piers, supporting the thinner masonry web of the ceiling. Third, and most crucial, was the invention of the flying buttress, an external arched support system that transferred the remaining outward thrust of the heavy nave vaults entirely outside the building, down into massive stone piers planted in the earth. This was a paradigm-shifting breakthrough. By moving the structural load-bearing skeleton to the exterior of the building, the walls between the columns were entirely freed from carrying the weight of the roof. Architects were able to replace the solid stone masonry with vast, soaring expanses of intricate stained glass, particularly the iconic circular rose windows. These windows served as glowing, colorful prisms that bathed the interior in ethereal light, while simultaneously functioning as a visual encyclopedia of biblical narratives for a largely illiterate medieval populace. The Gothic cathedral became a soaring skeletal cage of stone and glass, achieving a dematerialization of mass that perfectly embodied the medieval desire to reach heavenward. Renaissance to Neoclassicism, the dialectic of reason and drama. The period stretching from the 15th through the mid-19th century represents a dramatic pendulum swing in Western architectural and philosophical thought. The era oscillated wildly from the rational humanist revival of Antiquity and the Renaissance to the emotional, propagandistic theatricality of the Baroque and Rococo periods, before finally snapping back to the austere, moralizing geometry of Neoclassicism. This architectural evolution was a direct reflection of Europe's transition from the spiritual dominance of the medieval church to the age of absolute monarchs, and finally to the scientific rationalism of the Enlightenment and the birth of modern democracies. Originating in the affluent mercantile city of Florence in the early 15th century, the Renaissance, meaning rebirth, was an intentional, conscious rejection of the soaring, asymmetrical complexity and verticality of the Gothic style. The driving force behind this architectural revolution was the intellectual movement of humanism, which elevated human reason, intellect, and individual achievement, seeking to reclaim the lost wisdom, art, and literature of classical antiquity. Fueled by the immense wealth of private patrons, most notably the Medici family and the Catholic Church, architects turned their gaze back to the surviving ruins of Rome and the newly rediscovered texts of the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius. Renaissance architecture heralded a strict return to the classical orders, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, semicircular arches, and hemispherical domes. The aesthetic goal was to achieve perfect harmony, symmetry, and proportion, heavily reliant on pure geometric shapes, specifically the circle and the square, and mathematical ratios that reflected the perfection of the natural world and the human body. Vitruvius's principles of durability, usefulness, and beauty became the gold standard for measuring architectural success. Filippo Brunelleschi, widely considered the first true Renaissance architect, famously solved an seemingly impossible engineering crisis by designing the massive brick dome for the Florence Cathedral, Santa Maria del Fiore, completed in 1436. Drawing inspiration from his intense study of the Roman Pantheon, Brunelleschi engineered an innovative double-shell, self-supporting masonry dome. To prevent the structure from collapsing inward during construction, he utilized a brilliant herringbone bricklaying pattern that allowed the bricks to self-reinforce as the walls became increasingly inclined. He further reinforced the tension of the dome by embedding iron chains within the masonry. This allowed him to construct the largest masonry dome in the world entirely without the need for traditional wooden scaffolding, centering, a spectacular triumph of Renaissance intellect over medieval limitations. Later architects like Leon Battista Alberti codified these classical principles into highly influential written treatises, asserting that architecture should be grounded in the imitation of nature. In the 16th century, Andrea Palladio's perfectly symmetrical, mathematically proportioned villas in the Veneto, such as the Villa Rotonda, established a standard of residential design that heavily influenced centuries of subsequent global architecture. Crucially, the Renaissance redefined the role of the architect. No longer an anonymous stonemason of a medieval guild, the architect was elevated to the status of a celebrated intellectual, an artist, and a master of linear perspective, designing structures that appealed to human emotion through the lens of pure mathematical reason. By the dawn of the 17th century, the geopolitical and religious landscape of Europe had violently ruptured. The Protestant Reformation drastically undermined the absolute authority, wealth, and influence of the Catholic Church in Northern Europe. In response, the Church launched the Counter-Reformation, utilizing art and architecture as highly weaponized tools of religious persuasion. Following the Council of Trent, the Church mandated that art should communicate theology directly, arousing profound emotion and awe to draw the wavering masses back to the glory of the Catholic faith. The resulting Baroque architecture abandoned the calm, balanced, and rational perfection of the Renaissance in favor of a rhetorical style of overwhelming emotional intensity, dramatic movement, and triumphant grandeur. Baroque architects took the classical vocabulary of the Renaissance and transformed it into a dramatic, theatrical performance. Static, perfect circles were stretched into dynamic, restless ovals and ellipses. Flat, symmetrical facades were warped into undulating serpentine curves, and strict classical columns were twisted into spiraling forms. The style was defined by deep chiaroscuro, the extreme high-contrast interplay of light and dark shadows across complex masonry. exuberant, overwhelming ornamentation, and the seamless integration of painting, sculpture, and architecture to create dizzying illusions of infinite, heavenly space. A primary example of this early shift is the Church of Il Gesù in Rome, the mother church of the Jesuit order, designed by Vignola to provide free visual access to the high altar, drawing worshippers directly into the theatrical drama of the Mass. In Rome, the epicenter of the movement, an intense, legendary rivalry between Gian Lorenzo Bernini and Francesco Borromini defined the era. Bernini utilized sweeping theatrical grandeur and classical order, exemplified by his design of the majestic, embracing colonnades of St. Peter's Square. Borromini, in stark contrast, relied on highly complex, experimental, interlocking geometric forms to create pulsating, mathematically mind-bending church interiors. As the Baroque style spread beyond Italy, it was eagerly adopted by absolute monarchs to express their divine right to rule. In France, architects like Louis Levaux harnessed a more restrained, classical variation of the Baroque style to construct the breathtaking Palace of Versailles for King Louis XIV. By utilizing massive, imposing scale, rich materials like gold and marble, and the famous Hall of Mirrors, which weaponized light and reflection, the palace projected the absolute, inescapable, and centralized power of the French state over both its subjects and the natural landscape. The Baroque became the first truly global architectural style, exported via European colonial initiatives and missionary networks to the Americas and Asia, where it was adapted to incorporate local materials and indigenous decorative traditions. In the early 18th century, following the death of the Sun King Louis XIV in 1715, the French aristocracy eagerly abandoned the heavy, oppressive, and highly formalized court life of Versailles, relocating to private townhouses, hôtels particuliers, in Paris. This socio-political shift birthed the Rococo style, often considered the late Baroque, which represented a profound softening, lightening, and feminization of architectural interior space. While the Baroque was a public, monumental, and propagandistic architecture utilized by popes and kings to awe the masses, Rococo was almost exclusively focused on private, domestic interiors. The architectural epicenter of the Rococo was the salon, intimate, beautifully decorated spaces designed for elite intellectual gatherings, entertainment, and witty conversation among the Parisian upper class. Architects reacted against the muscular theatricality and heavy emotion of the Baroque by employing delicate asymmetry, curvilinear serpentine lines, and whimsical, highly detailed ornamentation. The Rococo aesthetic was defined by the rocaille motif, intricate plasterwork inspired by natural forms like shells, sea foam, and foliage, alongside an exotic fascination with imported Chinese arts, chinoiserie. The Hôtel de Soubise in Paris perfectly encapsulates the Rococo ideal. Designed by Germain Beaufrand, the rooms intentionally dissolve rigid structural boundaries by utilizing oval floor plans and hiding the corners of the ceiling with elaborately carved gilded stucco. The heavy, dark colors and dramatic shadows of the Baroque were entirely replaced by light, airy pastel palettes, white wooden paneling, boiserie, and the extensive use of mirrors to multiply candlelight and create an atmosphere of lighthearted, indulgent elegance. Ultimately, Rococo represented the exhaustion of absolute power, trading religious fervor and imperial dominance for aristocratic leisure and visual delight. By the mid-18th century, a profound intellectual and moral backlash against the perceived frivolity, vanity, and decadence of the Rococo period gave rise to the Neoclassical movement. This architectural paradigm shift was inextricably linked to the Age of Enlightenment, a sweeping philosophical era that championed empiricism, scientific inquiry, rationality, and the belief in universal laws of nature. Concurrently, the explosive archaeological excavations of the perfectly preserved ancient Roman cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, combined with the immense popularity of the Grand Tour among the European elite, provided architects with direct, highly accurate documentation of authentic classical ruins for the first time. Neoclassical architects sought to strip away the theatrical illusions of the Baroque and the superfluous asymmetrical ornamentation of the Rococo, aiming to return to a purer, more authentic classical style based on simple geometry and true load-bearing structures. The theoretical foundation of the movement was powerfully articulated by the French Jesuit and philosopher Marc-Antoine Laugier in his 1753 Essai sur l'architecture. Laugier argued for a deeply rational approach to architecture based on the conceptual model of the primitive hut, insisting that all architecture derived from three simple natural elements: the column, the entablature, and the pediment. He condemned the Baroque use of engaged columns, broken pediments, and pilasters as irrational, merely decorative confections that violated the structural truth of building. The resulting neoclassical architecture was characterized by severe geometric simplicity, a preference for flat, blank walls, true load-bearing structural columns, and a stark lack of applied ornament. This rational, highly ordered aesthetic perfectly aligned with the rising democratic and republican ideals of the era. Structures like the Altes Museum in Berlin, designed by Karl Friedrich Schinkel, embodied this new era. Conceived as a public institution for education and enlightenment, the Altes Museum featured a monumental Ionic colonnade and a central rotunda directly inspired by the Pantheon, utilizing classical forms to elevate the civic minds of the public. In the newly formed United States, the Capitol building and the White House were explicitly designed in the neoclassical style to visually and ideologically connect the new American democracy to the enduring idealized legacy of the ancient Roman Republic. However, as the 19th century progressed, the massive societal upheaval of the Industrial Revolution drastically altered the architectural landscape. The mass production of iron, steel, and glass offered unprecedented structural capabilities, challenging the dominance of traditional stone masonry and classical rules. In response to the rapid urbanization, mechanization, and perceived soullessness of the industrial age, a powerful romantic counter-movement emerged: the Gothic Revival. The Gothic Revival was not merely an aesthetic choice, but a deeply moral and philosophical crusade, sparking what became known as the Battle of Styles between Neoclassicism and Gothicism. The movement was spearheaded in England by architects like Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin, who published the highly influential book Contrasts in 1836. Pugin argued that classical architecture was inherently pagan and that the industrial age had brought about moral decay. He posited that the only true, honest, and Christian architecture was the Gothic style of the Middle Ages, which he believed reflected a society of faith, artisan craftsmanship, and social cohesion. This philosophical stance led to widespread adoption of the Gothic Revival for churches, universities, and civic buildings across the Western world, most famously realized in Charles Barry and Pugin's design for the new Houses of Parliament in London. Thus, by the mid-19th century, architecture was defined by an intense ideological struggle: the rational, democratic structuralism of neoclassicism, wrestling against the romantic, morally charged nostalgia of the Gothic Revival. The vast chronological sweep of architecture from 3000 BCE to the mid-19th century demonstrates unequivocally that the built environment is never merely a neutral container for human activity. Rather, it is an active, frozen record of humanity's ongoing, relentless negotiation with gravity, climate, natural resources, and shifting ideological paradigms. The ancient monumentalism of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Mesoamerica reveals nascent, highly structured societies utilizing sheer, back-breaking mass and precise astronomical alignment to mediate their terrifying relationship with the cosmos and assert the absolute divine authority of their centralized rulers. Classical antiquity, pioneered by Greece and Rome, represents a profound cognitive shift in human history, replacing raw, imposing mass with mathematical proportion, optical refinements, and revolutionary civil engineering, specifically the invention of concrete and arcuation, to shape civic identity and enclose vast public spaces designed for human occupation. In the East, the highly sophisticated interlocking timber framing of China and Japan, alongside the cosmic geometric mandalas of Hindu and Khmer temple mountains like Angkor Wat, demonstrate a brilliant alternative path. These traditions prioritized seismic resilience, the modular fluidity of space, and an innate philosophical harmony between the built structure and the raw natural landscape. The Middle Ages saw a dramatic, bifurcated evolution driven entirely by theological imperatives. In the West, moving from the heavy, defensive sanctuaries of the Romanesque to the skeletal, light-filled, gravity-defying heights of the Gothic cathedral, fueled by the metaphysics of light, while in the East and South, Islamic architecture perfected the geometry of the aniconic void and the horseshoe arch. Finally, the dramatic centuries spanning the Renaissance to the mid-19th century illustrate an intense, volatile ideological dialectic. This era represents a continuous struggle between the rational, humanistic pursuit of classical perfection initiated by Brunelleschi and Palladio, the emotional, rhetorical manipulation and absolute power projection of the Baroque Counter-Reformation, the aristocratic retreat of the Rococo, and the ultimate clash between the Enlightenment neoclassical rationalism and the romantic, moralizing fervor of the Gothic revival. Industrial catalyst and the liberation of form. The advent of the Industrial Revolution catalyzed a seismic shift across the globe, introducing an era where rapid technological advancement, sweeping globalization, and evolving social paradigms completely redefined the built environment. Architecture ceased to be merely a slow, generational evolution of traditional craftsmanship. Instead, it became a dynamic, rapidly iterating, and technologically driven discipline propelled by the relentless engine of mass production. The fundamental catalyst for this modern architectural paradigm was the mechanization of material production, specifically the industrialization of steel, glass, and concrete. Prior to this era, iron was cast in small, brittle quantities, glass was blown and spun laboriously into small panes, and the advanced concrete technologies of the ancient Romans had been largely lost to the passage of time. The 19th century revolutionized this restrictive paradigm entirely. Steel began rolling off newly invented production lines in standardized, highly predictable shapes, allowing for the rapid prefabrication of structural elements. By 1852, brick-making machines, such as the one patented by Richard A. Vervallen in New York and Henry Clayton's 1855 machine in the UK, capable of producing 25,000 bricks a day, industrialized even the most traditional materials. Glass manufacturing transitioned to the float process, producing consistent, massive sheets of clear plate glass that could enclose vast amounts of space without interrupting vision or requiring heavy mullions. Simultaneously, the refinement of reinforced concrete, a brilliant composite material combining the immense compressive strength of poured concrete with the incredible tensile strength of embedded steel rebar, unlocked unprecedented structural versatility and durability. These materials inherently and permanently altered the way buildings were put together, the raw materials that had to be used, and the underlying logic of how human spaces were organized. Because these materials could be produced at a staggering industrial scale and shipped globally via new railway and shipping networks, they successfully severed the traditional, mandatory link between a building and its immediate geographic context. A building constructed in London could now utilize the exact same structural components as a building in Chicago or Bombay. The industrial origin of these materials meant that vast, open floor plans became possible, facilitating the construction of immense factories, sprawling railway stations, and cavernous museums designed specifically to accommodate the rapidly urbanizing populations of the 19th century. Monuments of the Industrial Age, the Crystal Palace and the Eiffel Tower. The earliest, most dramatic, and most culturally shocking expressions of these new industrial materials were often found not in traditional civic, residential, or religious buildings, but in structures designed for highly specific purposes, such as industrial sectors or international exhibitions. A watershed moment in the history of the built environment occurred with the rapid construction of the Crystal Palace in London, designed to house the great exhibition of the works of industry of all nations in 1851. Conceived by Prince Albert, husband of Queen Victoria, to showcase global industrial prowess, the exhibition required a structure of unprecedented scale. The commission was ultimately won by Sir Joseph Paxton, who was not a traditional architect, but a botanist, horticulturalist, and greenhouse builder. Inspired by the optimal, naturally ribbed form and construction of the Victoria Regia water lily leaves he had studied extensively in his gardens, Paxton designed a colossal glass and iron exhibition hall that spanned over 18 acres. The building measured 1,848 feet long by 408 feet wide, reaching a height of 108 feet in its central transept. Paxton's design was revolutionary not only for its staggering scale, but for its methodology. It was entirely modular, utilizing prefabricated iron columns and slender girders that were assembled on site by over 2,000 workers from scratch in less than a year, completing on schedule and on budget. Paxton was even able to alter the design shortly before building began, adding a high, barrel-vaulted transept across the center of the building to safely enclose several large, full-grown elm trees that would otherwise have had to be felled, thereby resolving a controversial issue pushed by a vocal anti-exhibition lobby. The building shattered conventional architectural wisdom, creating an intricate network of slender iron rods sustaining walls of clear glass that felt weightless, dissolving the boundary between interior and exterior, and establishing a cultural trend that embraced Victorian ideals of enlightenment and progress. It was documented extensively by early photographers such as John Mayall, whose daguerreotypes were used to create engravings of the majestic interior, and Nicolaus Hennemann, who famously broke the fingers off a statue while trying to photograph it. The building's awe-inspiring steel structures and interior winter gardens were distributed worldwide, cementing the building's legacy as a functional precursor to modern architecture. Decades later, the culmination of 19th-century engineering prowess was fiercely demonstrated by the Eiffel Tower, constructed for the 1889 Universal Exposition in Paris to commemorate the centennial of the French Revolution. Engineered by Gustave Eiffel alongside structural engineers Maurice Koechlin and Émile Nouguier, and with architectural contributions by Stephen Soustreff, the tower was an unadorned, unapologetic celebration of iron latticework, rising to a record-breaking 300 meters. Comprising over 18,038 individual pieces of cast iron held together by 2,500,000 rivets, the tower was a masterpiece of wind resistance and prefabricated assembly, with elements bolted together in roughly 5-foot lengths at Eiffel's fabrication shop before being transported to the site for final riveting. The elevators themselves were engineering marvels, designed to ascend within the curved legs of the tower, starting at a 54-degree angle and leveling out to 78 degrees near the top. Despite its eventual status as a beloved global icon, its construction was met with intense hostility from the Parisian artistic establishment, who denounced the project as monstrous, out of place, and a threat to the classical beauty of the city. A famous petition published in the newspaper Le Temps, signed by prominent cultural figures including the novelist Alexandre Dumas Fils and the short story writer Guy de Maupassant, vehemently condemned the tower as an eyesore, describing it as the odious shadow of the odious column built of rivets and iron plates extending like a black blot. Eiffel fiercely defended his vision, arguing that engineers were equally preoccupied by beauty, elegance, and solidity. This intense controversy underscored a central defining tension of the late 19th century, the visceral clash between traditional, historically mandated architectural aesthetics and the raw, unadorned, and immensely powerful functionalism of industrial engineering. The first Chicago school, the architecture of capitalism, and the vertical city. While European engineers were erecting monumental, ephemeral exhibition structures that pushed the limits of iron and glass, architects in the United States, specifically in Chicago, were applying these identical industrial materials to solve a pressing, permanent urban crisis. In the late 19th century, rapid economic growth, skyrocketing land values in Chicago's central commercial district, known as the Loop, and a booming population converged to create an intense, unprecedented demand for concentrated commercial space. This intense economic pressure, coupled with the invention of the safe passenger elevator, the integration of electric lighting and indoor plumbing, and strict municipal fireproofing regulations following the devastating Great Chicago Fire of 1871, catalyzed the invention of a genuinely new architectural form, the skyscraper. The architects of the first Chicago school, including prominent figures like William LeBaron Jenney, John Wellborn Root, and the firm of Holabird and Roche, boldly abandoned the structural limitations of load-bearing masonry. Instead, they pioneered and promoted the new technologies of the iron and steel skeletal frame, which carried the entire weight of the building internally. This allowed the exterior walls to become mere curtains or cladding, fundamentally reversing millennia of structural logic. William LeBaron Jenney's home insurance building, completed in 1884, is widely cited as the progenitor of this method, utilizing a hybrid iron and steel frame that paved the way for the global skyline. Jenney, trained at the École Centrale des Arts et Manufactures in Paris, graduating in the class just before Gustave Eiffel, treated architecture as a structural art, organizing the building composition around the mastery of new materials. This structural innovation gave rise to a new spatial and exterior aesthetic, often referred to as the commercial style. Because the exterior masonry, usually lightweight terracotta cladding, no longer supported the building, architects could puncture the facades with massive expanses of glass. This led directly to the creation of the famous Chicago window, a tripartite fenestration featuring a large fixed center panel flanked by two smaller operable double-hung sashes, maximizing both natural light and necessary ventilation in an era before widespread artificial climate control. The Chicago School's skyscrapers were not merely structural marvels, they were potent monuments to the institutions powering American capitalism, specifically designed to house financial exchanges, banks, railways, insurance companies, and sprawling department stores. They fundamentally shifted the architectural paradigm from the horizontal to the vertical extrusion. From its very first appearance in the 1880s, the skyscraper was the subject of intense ideological battle. It was hailed globally as the ultimate symbol of capitalism's triumph and technological progress, while simultaneously serving as a visible target for anti-capitalist protest regarding the broader social impact of capitalism on the culture of building. Running parallel to the structural advancements of the Chicago School was the complex theoretical discourse regarding the aesthetic application of these materials. The revered architect Louis Sullivan, a mentor to Frank Lloyd Wright, famously coined the maxim, "Form follows function." While modernist historians later used this phrase to champion the total eradication of ornament, Sullivan himself never advocated for a sterile, purely utilitarian architecture. In his seminal essay, Ornament in Architecture, Sullivan suggested that while a building's form must logically follow its function, it should fundamentally follow the harmonious laws of nature. Sullivan's designs frequently featured lush, organic, low-tech adornments integrated deeply into the structural framework, proving that the early industrial vertical city still possessed a deep, poetic desire to connect with organic beauty before the austere rigidity of the mid-20th century took full control. The sociological crucible, urbanization, and the reorganization of human life. The architectural innovations of the 19th century cannot be decoupled from the profound social and demographic upheavals of the era. The Industrial Revolution triggered a massive demographic transition, drawing millions of people from rural agrarian villages into rapidly expanding towns and cities in search of paid factory work. This phenomenon, known as urbanization, completely reshaped the demographic map of Europe and the United States, swelling the populations of cities like London, Paris, Berlin, and Chicago to unprecedented levels. However, the rapid influx of workers vastly outpaced the development of adequate housing and municipal infrastructure. By the mid-19th century, there were thousands of industrial workers living in the most miserable, overcrowded conditions imaginable. Immigrants arriving in cities found themselves forced into polluted, densely packed slums awash with refuse, disease, and rodents. The physical layout of ancient cities with their narrow medieval streets was entirely unsuited for the daily commute of thousands of factory workers, while newer cities were often rapidly laid out in rigid grid patterns designed exclusively for commercial efficiency, taking very little account of fundamental human needs, such as privacy, adequate sunlight, and recreation. The dire conditions of the working class during this architectural and industrial boom eventually led to significant social unrest. Workers formed labor associations and political movements to vehemently demand better pay, improved housing, and safer working conditions. Over time, these pressures forced governments and urban planners to respond with sweeping reforms, including the implementation of minimum wage laws, occupational safety standards, and massively improved access to public services, sanitation, and transportation. Decades later, this fundamental tension between top-down urban efficiency and human-scale community living would erupt into a defining battle of the 20th century, epitomized by the legendary conflict between the powerful New York urban planner Robert Moses and the brilliant urban theorist Jane Jacobs. Moses championed large-scale projects, utilizing his immense bureaucratic power to bulldoze entire residential districts in the name of slum clearance, aiming to build high-rise towers and sweeping expressways that catered to the automobile. In stark contrast, Jacobs, in her monumental 1961 book The Death and Life of Great American Cities, launched a devastating critique of this top-down urban renewal. She successfully organized grassroots opposition to save her own Greenwich Village neighborhood from Moses's planned Lower Manhattan Expressway, fiercely arguing that true urban vitality stems from messy, mixed-use human-scale streets rather than isolated, sterile, modernist megablocks. This paradigm-shifting conflict permanently altered the trajectory of contemporary urban planning, reminding architects that the ultimate purpose of the built environment is to foster human connection. Early 20th century modernism, the eradication of ornament, and the machine aesthetic. As the 20th century dawned, the lingering romanticism, historical revivals, and ornamental excess of the late 19th century began to feel profoundly out of step with a mechanized, rapidly modernizing, and increasingly cosmopolitan world. The transitional phase of Art Nouveau, which had attempted to bridge the gap between traditional craftsmanship and modern iron and glass through sinuous, nature-inspired curves and whiplash lines, seen in the works of Victor Horta and Hector Guimard, quickly fell out of favor as being too ornate, expensive, and difficult to mass-produce. In Europe, a radical rethinking of the relationship between art, society, and industry took root, driven by a desire to sweep away the decaying structures of the past. This intellectual and aesthetic revolution was most prominently embodied by the Bauhaus, arguably the most influential architecture, art, and design school of the 20th century. Founded in 1919 by the visionary architect Walter Gropius in Weimar, Germany, the Staatliches Bauhaus was grounded in the concept of creating a Gesamtkunstwerk, or comprehensive artwork, wherein all the fine arts and crafts would eventually be brought together into a unified whole. Gropius's vision was heavily influenced by the British arts and crafts movement, specifically the philosophies of William Morris and John Ruskin, who had earlier protested the dehumanizing effects of industrial capitalism and championed the dignity of traditional craftsmanship. However, where Morris rejected the machine, Gropius sought to master it. The Bauhaus initially focused on individual handmade crafts under masters like John Itten, but it rapidly shifted under the pressures of the era to a more industrial focal point, attempting to unify individual artistic vision with the rigorous principles of mass production and a strict emphasis on function. The Bauhaus style is universally characterized by a total absence of historical ornamentation and a deep harmony between the function of an object or building and its design. Aesthetically, it favored simple geometric shapes, rectangles, spheres, rounded corners, curved chrome pipes, and long bands of industrial sash windows. To the Bauhaus masters, a steel I-beam was profoundly beautiful not despite its industrial origin, but precisely because of it. This utopian desire to create a better, more rational world extended from the design of a teapot or a chair to the layout of entire cities. The physical manifestation of this ethos was the Bauhaus building in Dessau, designed by Gropius and completed in 1925 after conservative political pressures forced the school out of Weimar. With its spare rectangular shape, revolutionary glass curtain walls, asymmetrical pinwheel design, and distinctive vertical typography, the Dessau building encapsulated the spirit of modernism. The Bauhaus faced intense political pressure from the rising Nazi regime, which viewed its cosmopolitan modernity, internationalism, and rejection of backwards-looking German nationalism as communist intellectualism, forcing the school to close its final Berlin location in 1933. However, this closure paradoxically ensured its global dominance. The school's master architects emigrated worldwide, formalizing what became universally known as the international style. The global dominance of this aesthetic was cemented by the landmark 1932 exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, in New York, curated by Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock, with support from Alfred H. Barr, Jr. The exhibition, titled Modern Architecture International Exhibition, gathered the works of Gropius, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, and Frank Lloyd Wright, officially introducing the American public to an architectural language that entirely abandoned classical symmetry and heavy masonry in favor of utility, volume, and lightweight industrial materials. Parallel to the developments at the Bauhaus in Germany, the Swiss-French architect Charles-Édouard Jeanneret, universally known as Le Corbusier, was formulating his own rigorous, highly influential, and often dogmatic doctrine of modernism. Viewing the house conceptually as a machine for living in, Le Corbusier sought to apply the inescapable logic, efficiency, and standardized perfection of automobile and steamship manufacturing to domestic architecture. By 1926, Le Corbusier crystallized his revolutionary theories into his famous 5 Points of Architecture, a universal systemic manifesto made possible entirely by the structural liberation provided by reinforced concrete. The first of these principles was the implementation of pilotis, which were slender, reinforced concrete stilts designed to lift the bulk of the structure off the damp ground. By elevating the living spaces, Le Corbusier eliminated the need for load-bearing walls at the ground level, allowing light, air, and vehicular traffic to flow freely beneath the building, while reclaiming the ground plane for human movement and natural landscape. The second principle, known as the free plan, was achieved by utilizing an internal grid of concrete columns and slabs, a structural framework Le Corbusier famously dubbed the Dom-Inno system. Because the weight of the building was carried entirely by these internal posts, rather than thick dividing walls, the interior layout was completely freed from structural constraints, allowing architects to design fluid, open interiors and place thin partitions precisely where they were needed for daily human life. Building upon this internal liberation, the third point championed the free facade. Since the outer walls no longer bore any structural weight, the exterior skin of the building could be designed with complete creative freedom, resulting in smooth, unencumbered surfaces free of traditional lintels and heavy masonry. This structural independence directly enabled the fourth point, the introduction of ribbon windows. These were long, continuous horizontal bands of glass that wrapped seamlessly around the facade, flooding the open interiors with massive amounts of even natural light, while reinforcing the stark planarity of the walls and establishing a panoramic visual connection with the surrounding landscape. Finally, replacing the traditional pitched roof, Le Corbusier advocated for the fifth point, roof gardens. He mandated the use of flat concrete roofs utilized as gardens or terraces, which functionally provided insulation and microclimate benefits, while philosophically compensating for the green footprint consumed by the building below, thereby bridging the man-made structure with the natural world. The absolute masterclass and purest expression of these continuous principles is the Villa Savoy, constructed between 1928 and 1931 in Poissy, on the outskirts of Paris. Commissioned by the wealthy Savoy family as a weekend country retreat, the villa was affectionately named Les Heures Claires, the sunny hours, due to the brilliant illumination captured by its sliding glass doors and ribbon windows. Hovering lightly above its pastoral site on pristine white pilotis, the cubic house features a sweeping ground floor curve mathematically calculated to accommodate the turning radius of the family's automobile. The Villa Savoy operates as a living manifesto of the international style, demonstrating how technological innovation could sever a building from traditional massing. Despite suffering severe damage during World War II and facing the threat of demolition, the building's profound architectural significance led to an international preservation campaign, resulting in its designation as a French historical monument during Le Corbusier's own lifetime and its eventual recognition as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Le Corbusier's influence extended far beyond individual residences. In 1933, he was instrumental in formulating the CIAM Athens Charter, a monumental document that sought to reshape entire urban landscapes by strictly separating the city into rigid functional zones for living, working, leisure, and transportation. While it provided a clear roadmap for post-war reconstruction, the charter's extreme functional segregation was later heavily criticized for destroying the organic, mixed-use vitality of historic cities. If Le Corbusier represented the sculptural, polemical, and highly formalized wing of early modernism, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe represented its absolute refinement into pure structural poetry and minimalism. Following his tenure as the final director of the Bauhaus, Mies emigrated to the United States, where he transformed the skylines of American cities through his uncompromising philosophy, encapsulated in the famous aphorism, "Less is more." Mies believed deeply that architecture should be essential, eliminating all superfluous decorative elements to emphasize the absolute purity of lines, spatial logic, and the inherent dignified beauty of modern industrial materials. Mies's architecture is characterized by a profound spatial fluidity and an obsessive dedication to proportion. His early European masterpiece, the Barcelona Pavilion, designed for the 1929 International Exhibition, was revolutionary for its angular lines, free-flowing spaces, and luxurious use of red onyx, travertine, and marble, without any applied ornamentation. In the United States, his residential masterwork, the Farnsworth House in Plano, Illinois, realized his concept of connecting built space with natural settings by creating a seemingly weightless glass pavilion suspended 5 feet and 3 inches above a floodplain on pristine white steel columns. The house was born out of a prestigious commission where client Edith Farnsworth notably selected Mies over both Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright. However, it was in the realm of the corporate high-rise that Mies left his most indelible and widely imitated mark. The Seagram Building, completed in 1958 on Park Avenue in New York City, set the absolute benchmark for the modern skyscraper. Utilizing a structural frame clad in custom bronze extrusions and tinted dark glass, the Seagram Building exudes a sleek, dark, and solemn verticality extending 515 feet into the sky. By boldly setting the tower back from the street to create a sprawling horizontal granite plaza at its base, Mies masterfully utilized proportion and negative space, transforming the dense urban grid and offering a dignified, elegant entrance hall bathed in light. This minimalism was not merely an absence of detail, but an invitation for the observer to engage deeply with the essential clarity, proving that profound beauty and clarity could be found in a simple line and perfect proportion. Operating concurrently with the European modernists, yet deeply critical of their universal, machine-like international style, was the towering American architect Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright, who designed over 1,000 structures in his lifetime, pioneered the philosophy of organic architecture, a term he introduced as early as 1908. Expanding on his mentor Louis Sullivan's slogan, "Form follows function," Wright asserted that form and function are one, using nature as the ultimate example of this integration. Wright believed that a building should not be an alien, universally applicable box dropped onto a site, but rather a sentient, rational entity that grows naturally out of its specific environment, reflecting the harmony of the natural world and enhancing the landscape it occupies. Wright vehemently rejected the idea of making a bank look like a Greek temple or a home look like a factory. His spatial concepts, beginning with his early prairie style, favored strong horizontal lines, deep roof overhangs, and the fluid integration of interior and exterior spaces, effectively breaking the confining box of traditional Victorian rooms. This is profoundly evident in the Francis W. Little House II, built 1912 to 1914, whose sprawling living room, now meticulously preserved in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, embodies the horizontal echo of the Midwestern landscape. The absolute zenith of Wright's organic philosophy, however, is Fallingwater, a weekend residence constructed in the 1930s for the Kaufman family over a waterfall at Bear Run in rural Pennsylvania. Rather than placing the house across from the waterfall to view it, Wright boldly anchored the structure directly into the rock formations above the cascading water, utilizing daring reinforced concrete cantilevers that thrust outward into the forest canopy. The design relies on locally sourced natural stone that mimics the geological stratifications of the site, establishing a profound sensory connection with the landscape and ensuring the home feels as though it had always inevitably belonged to the forest. Falling water remains an unparalleled illustration of how industrial materials, specifically the tensile strength of reinforced concrete, could be utilized not to dominate or ignore nature, but to achieve a lyrical, symbiotic resonance with it. This masterpiece cemented Wright's legacy, despite his highly publicized personal scandals and frequent bitter philosophical clashes with contemporaries like Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe. The global export of modernity, utopian visions in Chandigarh and Brasília. By the mid-20th century, the principles of modernist architecture had been exported globally, evolving from theoretical European manifestos into the official architectural language of the post-war world. As newly independent or rapidly modernizing nations sought an architectural identity that signified a definitive break from colonial pasts and a bold leap into the technological future, they turned to the masters of modernism to design entirely new capital cities. In India, after independence, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru commissioned Le Corbusier to plan and design the new capital city of Chandigarh in the 1950s. Envisioned as a break with India's colonial past, the city was intended to embody the post-independence values of democracy, secularism, socialism, and non-alignment. Le Corbusier utilized raw concrete monumentalism to create a vast, highly organized administrative and residential grid divided into 47 massive sectors, complete with a primary capital complex, parks, and housing. It established a distinctly Indian form of modernism, signaling to the world that the nation was rapidly advancing, even if the city's rigid master plan later struggled to accommodate the organic, informal growth and slum expansion typical of rapidly growing populations. Simultaneously, the Brazilian government, under President Juscelino Kubitschek, tasked urban planner Lucio Costa and his former protege, architect Oscar Niemeyer, with designing the new inland capital of Brasília. Inaugurated in 1960, Brasília was a utopian project sculpted from the blank canvas of the central savannah, designed to invigorate the national identity and pull development inward from the coast. Costa's Plano Piloto organized the city into sweeping functional zones, utilizing Le Corbusier's concept of 6-story housing blocks supported on pylons to allow the landscape to flow beneath. Niemeyer, deeply influenced by his time working with Le Corbusier, but injecting a uniquely sensual, lyrical curve into his designs, created a series of breathtaking civic monuments. Utilizing stark white concrete, sweeping graceful parabolas, and primary color accents, Niemeyer's architecture in Brasília functioned as the ultimate realization of the modernist urban dream. However, while the city remains profoundly beautiful and moving as a sculptural achievement, its strict functional zoning and immense scale resulted in an environment that was often criticized for lacking the intimate, pedestrian-scale human experience, illustrating the inherent inflexibility of top-down modernist urban planning when faced with unforeseen future developments. Mid to late 20th century reactions, the fracturing of the modernist consensus. Following the catastrophic physical and moral devastation of World War II, Europe faced an urgent, desperate demand for mass reconstruction, collective stability, and affordable social housing. In light of economic ruin and post-war austerity, the sleek, lightweight, and increasingly corporate, polished aesthetics of the international style appeared to many younger architects as superficial, nostalgic, and disconnected from the harsh realities of the working class. In response, a new highly polarizing movement emerged, primarily in the United Kingdom, driven by a raw socialist ethos, brutalism. Derived from the French expression béton brut, favored by Le Corbusier in his later works like the Unité d'habitation in Marseille, brutalism was championed by British architects such as Allison and Peter Smithson. The Smithsons famously declared brutalism to be an ethic, not an aesthetic, advocating for a rugged, unapologetic architectural language that sought absolute, unadorned honesty in its materials and structural methods. Brutalist buildings featured massive, weighty, and monumental forms characterized by exposed concrete that proudly bore the rough textures of its timber formwork, rejecting polite, painted facades in favor of a make-do-and-mend rawness. Brutalism quickly became the default global style for civic infrastructure, universities, and massive utilitarian social housing estates, spreading from the UK to Eastern Europe, Brazil, and the Americas. The movement's most ambitious goals were realized in projects like the Smithsons' Robin Hood Gardens in East London, completed in 1972. Intended to provide streets in the sky where neighbors could socialize, the massive concrete blocks featured acoustic barriers to block motorway noise and enclosed a peaceful central green mound. However, its imposing, heavy monumentality, combined with the rapid physical deterioration of poorly maintained concrete in damp climates and severe underfunding from local councils, quickly alienated the general public. Despite fierce campaigns by architectural preservationists, Robin Hood Gardens was demolished in the late 2010s, though a three-story segment was salvaged by the V&A Museum to preserve its historical significance. This perceived failure of modern social housing reached a dramatic, symbolic climax in the United States with the demolition of the Pruitt-Igoe housing project in St. Louis, Missouri. Designed by Minoru Yamasaki in the Modernist style and completed in 1955, the massive 33-block complex initially promised improved living conditions. However, it quickly fell into severe disrepair, plagued by systemic poverty, a precipitously declining municipal population, intense racial segregation, and a total lack of maintenance funds from the housing authority. When the first of its towers were spectacularly imploded on live television in 1972, the architectural critic Charles Jenks seized upon the image, famously and inaccurately declaring it the day modern architecture died, pinning the exact moment to July 15, 1972 at 3:32 p.m. This photograph appeared globally, crystallizing the powerful Pruitt-Igoe myth, which incorrectly blamed the complex's demise entirely on its architectural design. This powerful visual myth conveniently distanced society from the confluence of structural racism, economic divestment, and political failure that truly doomed the project, accelerating the demolition of public housing worldwide and paving the way for postmodernism. The rigid, austere doctrines of modernism and the heavy utilitarianism of brutalism provoked a fierce intellectual and aesthetic backlash in the 1960s and 1970s, culminating in the advent of postmodern architecture. The seminal text of this rebellion was the architect Robert Venturi's 1966 manifesto, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, which Philip Johnson declared had freed us and untied the chains of modernism. Venturi, working closely with his partner Denise Scott Brown, launched a devastating humanist critique against the puritanical reductionism of Mies van der Rohe's less is more, famously and cheekily retorting that less is a bore. Venturi argued that orthodox modernism, in its attempt to break from tradition and start fresh, had stripped architecture of its intricate complexity and its fundamental ability to communicate, resulting in sterile, alienating urban environments. He advocated for a return to a non-straightforward architecture of inclusion, embracing ambiguity, historical memory, and the messy, contradictory vitality of everyday modern life. This philosophy was famously physically manifested in Venturi and Scott Brown's design for the Sainsbury wing of the National Gallery in London, completed in 1991. which deftly fused the classicism of the existing 1830s museum with modern steel and dark-tinted glass, playing games with false Corinthian columns to create a highly intellectual yet controversial postmodern pastiche. Postmodern architecture eagerly rejected the austerity of its predecessors, adopting a highly eclectic, visually complex, and playful approach. It enthusiastically reintroduced ornamentation, vibrant color, and overt historical references, such as classical columns, arches, and pediments, often deploying them with a sense of whimsy, irony, and deliberate disproportion. An outstanding example of this joyful approach is the Piazza d'Italia in New Orleans, designed by Charles Moore and completed in 1978. Serving as a public memorial to the city's Italian citizens, the plaza is a colorful, cartoonish arrangement of classical colonnades, neon accents, and a topographic map of Italy cascading into a fountain that even features Moore's own sculpted face. Rather than adhering to dogmatic purity, Moore's agenda was wildly democratic and inclusive, proving that the built environment could successfully utilize historical wit and irony to inspire joy and connect deeply with the general public. While postmodernists looked backward to history and symbolism to cure the ailments of modernism, another group of architects pushed the functionalist tenets of modernism to their extreme technological conclusions. Emerging in the 1960s and flourishing through the 1980s, high-tech architecture, also known as structural expressionism, bridged the aesthetic gap between the machine-age fascination of early modernism and the approaching digital era. Pioneers of this movement, including British architects Richard Rogers, Norman Foster, and Nicholas Grimshaw, alongside Italian architect Renzo Piano, sought to celebrate the rapid technological advancements of the space age, inspired by the launch of Sputnik and the Apollo moon landings, by turning the building inside out. High-tech architecture fetishized raw industrial components, utilizing massive amounts of metal, chrome, and glass to create buildings that visually resembled highly calibrated machines, grain silos, or oil refineries. A defining characteristic was the absolute, demonstrable visibility of the structure and the mechanical services, often resulting in open floor plans and an atmosphere akin to an airport. The absolute apotheosis of this style is the Centre Georges Pompidou in Paris, designed by Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers. Winning a 1971 international competition against 680 other entries, the young, then unknown architects proposed a radical utopian live center of information, situated in the dense historic Beaubourg plateau of the Marais district. The architects daringly placed all of the building's massive structural framework, escalators, and vividly color-coded mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems entirely on the exterior. This inside-out strategy was not merely aesthetic, it vastly increased the efficiency of the interior space, creating massive, uninterrupted, and highly flexible exhibition halls. Initially greeted by the Parisian public with a level of dismay akin to the early reception of the Eiffel Tower, its creation of a massive, gently sloping public plaza quickly transformed it into one of the most beloved and visited cultural institutions in the world, validating high-tech architecture's belief that extreme functionalism could result in deeply democratic spaces. This bold, high-tech language soon conquered the corporate world. In London, Richard Rogers designed the iconic Lloyd's of London building, completed in 1986, an incredibly futuristic structure featuring exposed pipes, external glass elevators, and a massive barrel-vaulted glass roof illuminating the trading floor, creating a highly flexible and enduring commercial success. Simultaneously, Norman Foster designed the HSBC main building in Hong Kong, completed 1985, which became the most expensive building in the world at the time. Devoid of a traditional central core, the building was constructed using a radical suspension structure with components prefabricated across the globe, shipped from the US, UK, and Japan, and assembled with unprecedented engineering precision. Structural Revolution, Fazlur, Rahman Khan, and the Second Chicago School. Simultaneous with the stylistic debates raging in Europe and the American coasts, the structural engineering of the skyscraper underwent a quiet but profoundly revolutionary leap forward in the United States, led by the brilliant Bangladeshi-American structural engineer Fazlur Rahman Khan. Working with the architectural firm Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, SOM, in Chicago starting in 1955, Khan fundamentally redefined the mathematical and physical limits of how humanity builds tall, ushering in the era of the Second Chicago School. Prior to Khan's innovations, skyscrapers relied on the traditional rigid steel frame structure. However, as buildings grew taller, this system became incredibly inefficient and economically unviable due to the massive, costly amount of internal steel required to resist lateral wind loads and prevent sway. Khan's genius lay in recognizing that the perimeter of the building itself could be utilized to carry these loads. He invented the tube structural system, treating the entire building envelope as a hollow, three-dimensional cantilevered tube anchored deeply into the ground, with the exterior walls bearing the lateral forces. Khan rapidly developed several highly efficient variants of this revolutionary concept. His first purely tubular design was the concrete DeWitt Chestnut Apartments in Chicago, 1963. For the 100-story John Hancock Center, 1969, he utilized a trussed tube system, placing massive, iconic diagonal X-braces across the exterior facade that visually and physically locked the vertical columns together, creating an instantly recognizable high-tech aesthetic while safely transmitting gravity and wind loads across multiple structural members. For the 108-story Willis or Sears Tower, 1973, Khan pushed the boundaries even further by inventing the bundled tube system, a design famously modeled after the varied heights of a protruding pack of cigarettes. By bundling several distinct structural tubes together in an asymmetric grouping, the building could reach unprecedented heights, holding the title of the world's tallest building for a quarter century, while simultaneously abandoning the traditional box-like form, allowing for versatile formulations of architectural space. Khan's elegantly simple innovations democratized the sky. By drastically reducing the amount of structural material required, he laid the underlying engineering foundation for almost every ultra-tall and super-tall skyscraper constructed globally today. Contemporary and future trends, the 21st century and the digital turn. As the 20th century drew to a close, the advent of highly advanced computational technology intersected with complex post-structuralist philosophy, unleashing a radical new architectural vocabulary known as deconstructionism. Gaining widespread controversial recognition following an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, curated by Philip Johnson and Mark Wigley, deconstructionism was positioned as a definitive chaotic rupture from both the rigid orthogonal grids of modernism and the ironic historical pastiche of postmodernism. Influenced heavily by the literary and philosophical theories of Jacques Derrida, who fundamentally attacked the metaphysics of presence and the hierarchical dualisms of Western thought, architects like Peter Eisenman and Bernard Tschumi sought to translate philosophical concepts of dislocation, absence, and fragmentation into physical, spatial voids. This complex intellectual collaboration, perhaps best represented by their joint proposals for the Parc de la Villette in Paris, the Choral Works, birthed a style that is visually jarring, characterized by a language of dissonance, radical asymmetry, non-rectilinear shapes, and a deliberate disruption of traditional spatial hierarchies. Buildings are designed to appear disjointed, distorted, or unstable, serving as a radical expression of the modern, chaotic human condition. The most universally recognized and influential practitioner of this discipline-shattering style is the Canadian-American architect Frank Gehry. Moving aggressively away from the straight lines that had dominated architecture for millennia, Gehry's work introduced complex, swooping, and deeply fragmented geometries. This aesthetic shift was made physically and economically possible only through the adoption of CATIA, a highly advanced 3D modeling software originally developed by Dassault Systèmes for the French aerospace and automotive industries. The absolute triumph of this synthesis of deconstructivist theory and aerospace technology was the Guggenheim Museum Bilbao, completed in 1997. Gehry used CATIA software to precisely map out the museum's wildly undulating non-Euclidean curves, allowing the Italian-based contractor Permasteelza to accurately cut the exterior cladding with a CNC router. After rejecting stainless steel for appearing dead in the cloudy Basque climate, Gehry clad the museum in thousands of incredibly thin, shimmering titanium panels that took on a velvety sheen reflecting the ever-changing colors of the Bilbao sky. The Guggenheim Bilbao was not merely an architectural masterpiece. It initiated a profound socio-economic phenomenon universally known as the Bilbao effect. The museum was the highly calculated crown jewel of a massive multi-decade urban revitalization strategy led by the Basque government and the public development firm Bilbao Ria 2000. Seeking to transition Bilbao from a decaying, heavily polluted industrial port plagued by high unemployment into a global center for tourism and culture, they partnered with Thomas Kearns of the Guggenheim Foundation. The staggering, meteoric success of the project, drawing 1.3 million visitors in its first year and fundamentally altering the global perception of the city, demonstrated the awesome power of iconic architecture as an economic engine. Consequently, the early 21st century has been characterized by a relentless global pursuit of starchitecture, with municipalities worldwide commissioning spectacular, gravity-defying cultural institutions in desperate hopes of capturing the world's attention and replicating Bilbao's miraculous urban renaissance. The computational liberation that allowed Gehry to build Bilbao evolved into a distinct, pervasive, and highly systematized architectural ideology for the 21st century, parametricism. Coined and fiercely advocated by Patrick Schumacher, the principal architect at Zaha Hadid Architects, who launched a manifesto for the style at the 2008 Venice Biennale of Architecture. Parametricism relies entirely on advanced algorithmic and associative modeling software to generate complex, fluid, and continuous architectural topologies. Rooted historically in the early computer manipulations of Ivan Sutherland's Sketchpad in 1963, parametric tools like Grasshopper now allow designers to dynamically alter variables in real time. Where modernism relied heavily on the rigid repetition of simple, identical geometric elements, parametricism relies on the principles of continuous differentiation and mutual correlation. In a parametric digital model, every element of a building's design is intrinsically linked through a network of algorithms. If one parameter, such as a site boundary, wind load, solar gain, or pedestrian flow, is altered, the entire structural geometry seamlessly recalculates, alters gradients, and adapts in real time. This results in buildings that lack traditional corners or abrupt transitions, instead featuring sweeping, biomorphic, and soft curves that fold and blend seamlessly into their surrounding contexts. The late Zaha Hadid utilized these advanced computational techniques to construct profoundly futuristic structures, such as the Maxi Museum in Rome and the Galaxy Soho in Beijing, where rigid structural divisions melt away into fluid, overlapping, and highly dynamic spatial continuities. the principles of continuous algorithmic responsiveness championed by parametricism have increasingly extended beyond the design of individual buildings into the macro scale of entire urban master plans, giving rise to the data-driven smart city. Cities built entirely from the ground up in the 21st century, such as Songdo in South Korea, Masdar City in the UAE, and the massive $500 billion NEOM project in Saudi Arabia, are designed with an invisible, omnipresent layer of digital infrastructure operating beneath the concrete and steel. In Songdo, for example, a vast network of ubiquitous sensors monitors real-time data regarding traffic flow, energy consumption, and air quality. Traffic lights dynamically adjust to minimize congestion based on real-time vehicle loads, and innovative pneumatic waste tubes suck refuse directly from residential apartment buildings to central processing plants, entirely eliminating the need for conventional garbage trucks. Simultaneously, recognizing the severe threat of global climate change and the catastrophic failure of traditional concrete drainage systems, contemporary urban planners are increasingly adopting the sponge city concept. Championed by pilot programs in China and successfully implemented in cities like Rotterdam and Singapore, the sponge city rejects impermeable concrete in favor of nature-based solutions. By utilizing permeable pavements, vast green roofs, bioswales, and restored natural waterways, these cities act like giant ecological sponges, capturing and absorbing massive amounts of rainwater during extreme weather events, preventing catastrophic flooding, and storing the water for use during dry periods. The imperative of sustainability, adaptive reuse, and social equity. Ultimately, the most defining and urgent paradigm shift of early 21st century architecture is not purely aesthetic or computational, but profoundly existential. The construction sector and the operation of buildings account for a staggering 36% of global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, with the production of concrete serving as a massive contributor to the climate crisis. Recognizing that the limitless, destructive extraction of resources initiated during the Industrial Revolution is no longer tenable for a global population projected to reach 9.3 billion by 2050, contemporary architecture is undergoing a radical, necessary pivot toward ecological sustainability, circular economies, and deep social inclusivity. Architects, engineers, and material scientists are actively seeking and implementing highly sustainable alternatives to the massive carbon footprint of traditional concrete and steel. One critical trend is the rapid advancement of 3D printing technology in construction. Companies like Mighty Buildings in California are deploying automated robotics to extrude houses layer by layer, utilizing thermoset composite panels made from 60% recycled materials. This technology dramatically reduces construction waste, expedites building timelines from months to mere weeks, and allows for the creation of zero-net energy homes that are remarkably resilient to extreme climate events. Concurrently, cross-laminated timber, or CLT, has emerged as a revolutionary low-embodied energy material for large-scale construction. The advent of plyscapers, high-rise buildings utilizing timber as their primary load-bearing structure, is effectively transforming massive urban buildings from carbon emitters into massive carbon sinks. Furthermore, the industry is increasingly adopting the principles of the circular economy. Moving away from the destructive take, make, waste model of the Industrial Revolution, contemporary architects are designing buildings with their entire life cycle in mind, designing out waste, prioritizing the use of secondary or recycled materials, and ensuring that buildings can be easily disassembled and their components endlessly reused. The greenest building is often the one that is already built. The 21st century has seen a massive embrace of adaptive reuse, where obsolete industrial structures are saved from demolition and repurposed for contemporary use, preserving both their embodied carbon and their historical character. A prime example of this is the Tate Modern in London, designed by the Swiss architectural firm Herzog and de Meuron. Commissioned in 1994 to convert the massive derelict Bankside power station on the south bank of the Thames, the architects deliberately chose to leave much of the building's raw, industrial character and imposing brick facade intact. They ingeniously converted the massive turbine hall into a breathtaking giant public gallery space that runs like an indoor street through the entire length of the building, initiating a breakneck urban revitalization of the once neglected Southwark district. Opening in 2000, the Tate Modern fundamentally changed art gallery design by proving that monumental industrial relics could be successfully integrated into the cultural fabric of the modern city. Beyond advanced material science and adaptive reuse, the fundamental social mandate of architecture is expanding rapidly. The global trauma of the COVID-19 pandemic mercilessly exposed the deep vulnerabilities of high-density, poorly ventilated urban living, sparking a massive demand for residential environments that prioritize health, natural ventilation, and immediate access to green spaces, often termed biophilic design, which recognizes the innate human psychological need for contact with nature. Concepts like the 15-minute city, a sustainable urban model where all essential civic, retail, and residential functions are accessible to citizens within a 15-minute walk or bicycle ride, are actively restructuring zoning laws away from the isolated, automobile-dependent grids of mid-century modernism. Furthermore, there is a pronounced, long-overdue push towards spatial equity and inclusivity in the built environment. Contemporary architects are increasingly tasked with designing spaces that actively dismantle the physical and social barriers of the past. Moving far beyond merely meeting basic accessibility standards, inclusive architecture embodies a paradigm shift that seeks to humanize spaces and combat social isolation. Following principles established by entities like the UK Design Council, 21st-century civic infrastructure, such as the modern public library, must be highly responsive, understandable, and accommodating to all patrons regardless of age, gender, mobility, or ethnicity. By recognizing the specific needs of diverse populations and ensuring that public spaces contribute directly to collective well-being, architecture is reclaiming its vital role as a tool for social innovation and communal dignity. The evolution of global architectural styles, from the soot-stained skies of the Industrial Revolution to the pristine, data-driven algorithms of the present day, is a profound testament to the relentless adaptability and ambition of human ingenuity. Architecture has successfully transitioned from a localized, slow-moving craft bound eternally by the heavy weight of stone to a highly industrialized, global science capable of defying gravity and enclosing vast volumes of space with shimmering membranes of glass, steel, and titanium. We have witnessed the pendulum of aesthetic and philosophical thought swing violently across the decades, from the machine-worshipping rationalism and austere, uncompromising purity of early modernism through the harsh ethical realities of concrete brutalism into the playful, colorful historical rebellion of postmodernism, and finally fracturing into the chaotic, computer-generated brilliance of deconstructionism. Yet beneath these rapid stylistic shifts lies a continuous, unbroken narrative of technological mastery and deep societal reflection. The mass-produced modular iron that built the Crystal Palace laid the direct conceptual groundwork for the algorithmic parameters shaping the smart cities of tomorrow. The structural courage of the first Chicago school directly enabled the bundled tubes of the modern super-tall skyline. Today, as the architectural discipline confronts the profound existential threats of anthropogenic climate change and the staggering complexities of rapid global urbanization, the focus has necessarily shifted away from the creation of spectacular, isolated, ego-driven monuments. Instead, the vanguard of contemporary design is moving toward the seamless synthesis of ecological resilience, advanced digital integration, and deep, empathetic social inclusivity. The buildings and cities of the future will not merely stand as static objects of aesthetic contemplation. They are destined to function as dynamic, responsive, and sustainable ecosystems, continually adapting to protect and elevate the human experience amidst the complex, ever-shifting forces of the 21st century.